Welcome back. Today's explainer tackles what is arguably the single most critical aspect of medical coding. We're going to completely demystify the exact logic used to calculate medical decision-making, or MDM, using the latest evaluation and management guidelines. Look, if you've ever felt totally overwhelmed by the complex elements, the dense rules, and all that tiny fine print, you are exactly in the right place. We're going to break this whole thing down so it makes perfect sense.
All right, let's look at our roadmap. 1. The core of MDM. 2. The 2 of 3 rule. 3. The MDM hierarchy rule. 4. A step-by-step case study. 5. Scoring the final level. And 6. Common calculation pitfalls.
Section 1. The core of MDM.
So we have to start by establishing exactly what medical decision-making actually represents in the coding world. Basically, it's divided into 4 distinct levels: straightforward, low, moderate, and high. You can kind of think of these levels as a precise measurement of the cognitive work, the actual brain power, and the complexity required from the provider during a patient encounter. You definitely can't just pick a level based on, say, how long the visit felt, right? There is a highly structured, objective method to arrive at one of these 4 tiers. And to accurately reach one of those 4 levels, we have to evaluate 3 very specific elements. These 3 elements are literally the foundational pillars of our entire scoring logic. First up, we look at the number and complexity of problems addressed, basically asking, how sick is this patient? Second, we calculate the amount or complexity of data to be reviewed and analyzed. This is all the labs, the tests, or maybe external records that the provider has to sift through. And third, the risk of complications and morbidity or mortality. This one looks directly at the risk associated with the patient's management or their specific treatment plan.
Section 2. The 2 of 3 rule. Now that we know our 3 pillars, we have to look at the first critical mechanical rule for calculating the overall score. And here is the crucial takeaway. You absolutely do not need all 3 of those elements to perfectly align. Not at all. The fundamental rule for determining your overall MDM level is simply the 2 out of 3 rule. To qualify for any given level, the visit just has to meet or exceed the requirements in at least 2 of the 3 elements we just went over. In real-world practice, this simply means you look at your 3 scores and you just drop the lowest one. Boom. That's it.
It really takes a lot of the stress out of coding, doesn't it? Because one weak element isn't going to drag down the entire encounter if the other 2 reflect a much higher complexity. You just use any 2 elements that meet or exceed a certain level, drop the lowest, and you're good to go.
Section 3. The MDM hierarchy rule.
But wait, what happens if all 3 elements land on completely different levels? Sometimes, a patient encounter is just all over the map. You might have a totally straightforward problem, but an incredible amount of data to review, and then a moderate risk level. When this happens, we rely on the MDM hierarchy rule. This rule dictates that if all 3 MDM elements result in 3 completely different complexity levels, you must follow the hierarchy and select the middle level. Just think of it as your ultimate built-in tiebreaker.
Let's actually see that tiebreaker in action. Imagine the number and complexity of problems is scored as low, the data reviewed is moderate, and the risk of complications happens to be high. So we have a low, a moderate, and a high. Because all 3 are completely different, the middle score is always going to win. Therefore, your final medical decision-making level in this scenario would just be moderate. Makes perfect sense, right?
Section 4. Step-by-step case study.
Let's see how all this builds when we apply these abstract rules to a tangible, real-world clinical scenario. Here's our case study. A patient presents to the clinic with an acute, uncomplicated urinary tract infection, or UTI. During the encounter, the provider orders some lab tests. Now, because the patient is a bit confused, the provider also has to obtain the patient's history from a caregiver, which we call an independent historian. Finally, the provider decides to manage the issue by prescribing a new antibiotic medication. Okay, let's score this step by step. Step 1. We evaluate element 1, the number and complexity of problems addressed. Based on the standard guidelines, an acute uncomplicated illness slots perfectly into the low complexity tier. It's definitely not a severe exacerbation, but hey, it is more than a minor self-limited problem like a common cold. So, for element 1, we are locking in a low score.
Step 2, we evaluate element 2, the data. And this is where it gets really interesting. The provider ordered lab tests, which instantly gives us points in the tests and documents category. But crucially, the provider also had to get history from the caregiver. An assessment requiring an independent historian instantly fulfills the criteria for a very specific data category. Combining these two distinct actions pushes our data element right up into the moderate level.
Step 3. We evaluate element 3, the risk of patient management. Our provider decided to treat the UTI with a prescription medication. According to the risk logic, prescription management, whether it is a brand new medication or even just adjusting an existing one, lands squarely in the moderate risk category. So, element 3 is moderate.
Section 5. Scoring the final level.
Now it's time to bring all three of our isolated elements together to calculate the final code for the encounter. Here is our final tally. Problems addressed was low, data reviewed was moderate, risk of management was moderate. To find the overall MDM, we apply our trusty 2 out of 3 rule. We look at our 3 scores and literally just drop the lowest one, which in this case is the low for problems. That leaves us with 2 moderate scores. Therefore, these 2 scores dictate a final overall medical decision-making level of moderate. That would ultimately point us toward a final CPT code like 99204 or 99214, totally depending on if it's a new or an established patient.
Section 6. Common calculation pitfalls.
Before we wrap up this explainer, we really need to address where coders and providers, honestly, frequently make mistakes during these calculations. The 2 biggest traps are undercoding and overcoding. Undercoding often happens when providers actually do complex work, like reviewing extensive prior records or consulting with an independent historian, but they fail to explicitly document it. If it isn't documented, you literally cannot score it, which leads to artificially low data thresholds and straight-up lost revenue. On the flip side, overcoding occurs when coders assume complexity that simply isn't written down, claiming higher levels of MDM than the documentation actually supports. A vague phrase like follow up in 1 week definitely does not justify high-risk decision-making.
So I want to leave you with this one critical question. Does your documentation truly reflect the complexity of your medical decision-making? The 2 out of 3 rule and the hierarchy rule are incredibly powerful tools to ensure accurate coding. But you've got to remember to document every unique test, every independent historian, and the medical necessity behind your prescriptions. The rules can only capture the complexity that is actually on the page. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Decode Healthcare with Harshal.